Grief is real, big, better shared. The podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear.
I'm Kevin Lee, President and CEO of Mid-America Transplant, and we are honored to sponsor this episode of Grief is real, big, better shared. At Mid-America Transplant, we have the privilege of working with families across southern Missouri and northeast Arkansas who make the heroic decision to donate their loved ones' organs or tissues. While donation often brings families comfort, they are still heartbroken by their loss. We are driven by compassion for these families and continue to walk with them through their grief journey. Mid-America Transplant provides several programs to help families memorialize their loved one, but we believe that some of the best support can be provided by a grief center. We are proud to work with the Center for Good Grief and appreciate everything they are doing in the region to bring healing to people who are coping with loss. Mid-America Transplant is inspired by life and by the donor families who give transplant patients a second chance at life. For more information about being a donor, visit sayyesgivelife.org.
Hello, welcome to Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared, the podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear. I'm Angela Hamblin-Kelly, the administrator of the Baptist Centers for Good Grief, and we're so glad that you are tuning in today. If this is your first time checking out our podcast, please know that we have Season 1 available wherever you get your podcast. In Season 1, there's a lot of great content about grief in general, about spouse loss, men in grief, and important things to know about childhood and adolescent grief. So make sure you go back and catch up on those episodes. With Season 2, we've heard from you and we listened to you, and we're going to focus more on some specific topics in a very short format. Just as a reminder, the Baptist Centers for Good Grief has been providing grief care for over 25 years. We've grown from a children's grief camp to a program with 3 comprehensive grief centers in Tennessee and Arkansas. We started this podcast because grief is the most universal experience there is. Again, this is the podcast everyone needs to hear because grief involves pain and vulnerability, which is also why this is the podcast nobody wants to hear. So I sit here today as a grief counselor, but I'm also a griever. So in our podcast, we hope to honestly look at grief and discuss the heart and head tug of war from an evidence-based grief counseling perspective, but also the very real-life perspective as well. So a common phrase that we hear at the Baptist Centers for Good Grief is, "I feel like I've lost my mind." Many grieving people will come to us and say, "I just feel like I've lost my mind. I feel like I can't remember things." And so we're going to talk about that and where that falls with grief. And I'm joined here today with Lauren, our clinical director at the Baptist Centers for Good Grief. So Lauren, thanks so much for being here today.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So I know, Lauren, you hear that a lot as well, many times a day as people call in. And, you know, in this podcast, we've talked so much about what is grief, all those thoughts and feelings that run around inside our body after someone we love dies. We talk about the very common, normal grief responses that we all have when we have suffered the death of a loved one. And we know that those are physical, spiritual, emotional, behavioral, and cognitive. And so today we wanted to focus on those cognitive grief responses because of that sentence that so many people feel and express of, "I feel like I've lost my mind." Mm-hmm. How do you hear that, Lauren?
Well, you know, I think grief is one of those topics that we don't talk about a lot until we are experiencing it. And so I think a lot of times people just aren't prepared for what grief might look like and for all of those ways that grief can affect them. And I think that cognitive piece can be one of the most jarring because I think people worry that that's going to last forever. Yes. You know, that all of a sudden I'm feeling forgetful. I can't find my keys. I'm mixing up appointments. I can't, keep a train of thought. I'm easily distracted. And they worry, is this how things are going to be now? And they worry, what's wrong with me? Because I think a lot of times we expect certain grief reactions. Mm-hmm. We expect to feel sad, maybe a little angry, we have some of those expectations, but we don't always take into consideration that cognitive piece. And I think that what we see as far as the cognitive side of the grief experience is that, first of all, your brain is trying to process what happened. So it's going over every detail related to your lost experience. You're asking questions. Your brain is trying to make sense of something that doesn't feel like it makes a lot of sense.
Right.
This person who has been a significant part of your life and is a very important person to you is not here in the same way. And your brain cannot wrap itself around that right away. And so it's very much a process of trying to figure that out. So a lot of mental energy is devoted to that. And then because of that, the other piece of it is just what we see as far as some symptoms, you could say, distractibility, forgetfulness, just kind of generally feeling like you're in a mental fog, those kinds of things.
I was just reminded as you were talking, there's a great quote from C.S. Lewis of his book, A Grief Observed, which is really a great read for some folks. And he talks about the cognitive piece of grief. He described it as oftentimes feeling mildly drunk or like concussed, like from having a concussion. And so that just really spoke to me as I was hearing you. I was reminded of that. Like it really changes, and that, just your thought processes and your thinking. And that's why people come to us and say, I feel like I'm losing my mind. People will oftentimes use the phrase too that they feel like they're crazy, and that's where that links to what you were saying about how scary that can be.
Absolutely.
And is this, and especially in grief, we talk about, this is a new normal. You're figuring out your new normal, and people are like, is this going to be my new normal? Yeah. I had a client once who was so worried about that because she kept losing her keys. Like constantly losing her keys. And she was just like, I can't start off every day like this, and then it would spiral and lead her down a path the rest of the day. And it all started with that distractibility, as you mentioned, know.
And too, when we're grieving, we still have the stresses and pressures of everyday life. And so, one thing that I'll hear a lot is, people may struggle with work, or children may have a hard time at school. And we know that that's, of course, very understandable, and that it's important to have time and, just to give yourself permission to not be 100% on top of things in the same way that you were for a while. We don't always feel like we have that permission, from society in general. And so then people can feel very conflicted. They feel like they should be performing or functioning at a higher level than what they are.
Right. And a lot of times they're not performing at that level because of the disbelief. That's where it's kind of starting. Like you said when we first started talking was, how did this happen? Like, those why questions that will come up. And so that disbelief takes over the space in the brain that normally, holds the task and the, sharpness maybe that we have to do things that we always do. And now all of a sudden finding that we can't do them. And a lot of times it's because that disbelief has settled in. Some clients have described it as a fog, like a fog settles in.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important what you brought up about the questions. You mentioned why questions. Those are one of the big ones that we hear a lot. And also we hear a lot of what if questions. I think those are two of the most common ones that we hear, and also two of the hardest, because they're not questions that have definite answers.
Right.
And so what people find is that they're asking themselves questions that they can't find the answer to, and it feels like they're repeatedly asking the same thing over and over, and it can feel like they're not really getting anywhere. I think it's important for people to know that there is a function and a purpose to asking those questions.
Yes.
That you may not ever find the answer, and that's okay. But part of the grief process is giving yourself that space and permission to ask.
Absolutely. And don't you think also those repetitive thoughts continue maybe when we're kind of doing kind of what we're wired as humans to do, which is to push things away, especially painful things, to think about them. But those repetitive thoughts continue because they're telling us, I need your attention. I need this. And And so what we want people to know is that it is important to sit with those, and there is value in it. And maybe doing it with a trusted friend or a counselor is very important because those thoughts are demanding attention.
Absolutely. And, I think what we find as people work through their grief and allow themselves to ask those questions and to say them out loud and to, as you said, talk about them with somebody and just really process them, they maybe reach a point where even if they don't have an answer, that they don't have that need to ask that question so frequently. Right. But again, it's a process to get there.
And I think let's give racing thoughts a little bit of attention and how those racing thoughts can really take up the space of our brain, take up the space of our thoughts.
I think it goes back to your brain is just naturally trying so desperately to make sense of this. And so it is firing on all cylinders, trying to wrap itself around what has happened. And so sometimes what that ends up looking like is, even though your brain feels like it's working overtime, it doesn't necessarily feel like it's working the most efficiently.
Right.
And so you might find that your thoughts are jumping from one to the next, or they're racing, or you're, asking the same question or having the same running thought going through your mind over and over again. And I think it's just important to keep in mind that that's natural. That's your brain's way of trying to cope. And so there is a purpose to that, and that it won't be like that always.
Right. And there's some really specific interventions that can help with racing thoughts and things like that. And I think if you're experiencing that, that's really important to maybe reach out to a counselor or someone to help you with those. Because, again, while we say that it is normal to have those, we're not all programmed and ready to be able to figure that out on our own.
Yeah.
And so even though we're kind of focusing here on the cognitive piece of grief, we know that these things don't happen in their own individual silos. Cognitive factors of grief and emotional factors can merge together. And another thing that we hear a lot about or get a lot of questions about from people regarding this topic is depression and grief. What is depression? What is grief? Kind of what you said when we first got started, Lauren, about the fear that kind of my grief reactions are making me think now that I'm going to be depressed for the rest of my life. So let's give a little attention to depression and grief.
Yeah. A lot of what we see as very natural, normal grief reactions are also depressive reactions. And again, there's actually a purpose to that. I know that sort of sounds odd, but if you think about depressive reactions, what they tend to do is they tend to slow people down.
Right.
You might feel more tiredness, less energy, less motivation. Generally, a lot of times people may feel more sluggish. And that's physical and mental and emotional. That's every part of you. And we know that grief needs space. We know that grief needs time. I think a lot of times we are hardwired to just try to keep going and get back to normal. And that's kind of what we want, but that's not what we're needing. And sometimes our body and our mind has these grief reactions that serve that purpose of kind of forcing us to slow down a little bit.
Absolutely.
That said, so there is definitely an overlap between what we would consider depressive symptoms or reactions and grief reactions. And we want to be careful not to minimize one or the other. So what we see with grief reactions is that it really is in response to the loss. You really see often a connection between the symptoms that you're experiencing and the loss experience. By that, I mean you may not have had those kinds of symptoms before your loved one died. You might find that, for example, some of the thoughts that you're having, maybe recurring thoughts and things of that nature, are really focused on that person. You're longing for them. questions about their death. It's really related to that. Whereas a clinical depression is a lot more generalized.
Right.
And those thoughts, those reactions are not necessarily focused on a lost experience.
And also looking at how you're continuing to function, right? You know, with grief, we also know that, and I love how you said that, it does cause us to slow down. And that does not feel good, but it's like our body does know, whoa, this is so abnormal. I don't know what to do with this. There are so many things, that I'm experiencing inside, and it's almost just like putting you in neutral just to settle down. But that is so opposite, I think, of how we're wired as people. It's this like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and keep going, keep going, keep going. And then don't even get me started on how we reward people for that. But grief forces a lot of people to slow down. And I think just this topic of, I feel like I've lost my mind. Sometimes people will say it's because I don't have energy, I just can't get myself out of bed because it's slowing them down, like you were saying. But then they'll automatically revert over to, but now I'm depressed, and I must need major help now because I'm depressed. And so there are some things that we sort of have to sit down with people and say, well, let's talk about this. Let's talk about what you were like before your loved one died. Was this a symptom, like you said, that was happening before? Was it interfering with your ability to take care of your daily tasks and routines? And sometimes it is. I mean, depressed people with clinical depression will also grieve.
Yes, absolutely. And it's, as you said, things aren't just in their own individual, you said silos, sometimes I say bubbles. It's not like you have your grief on one side and your depression on the other, and that you're just sort of experiencing them simultaneously. They interact with each other. Your grief can affect your depression. You may feel it more intensely, and your depression may affect your grief, make it more difficult possibly to find and utilize some of those coping skills. And certainly, I don't mean to imply that that's impossible. It just may mean that, that requires some intention and care,
right, and
support.
Definitely. So the intention meaning, possible counseling, grief counseling, opportunities to help with expression, that kind of thing for sure. Yeah.
One area I think that there's pretty significant overlap between grief and maybe clinical depression is self-confidence.
Good point.
Because, often, of course, we kind of expect that with clinical depression, that it affects somebody's self-esteem, their identity, all of that. And what we see with grieving people is that they can experience a loss of self-confidence as well.
Absolutely.
Because they're in this new world that that's unfamiliar, and their loved one was tied to their identity. Their loved one may have contributed to their self-esteem and validated them, and so they're learning to navigate this world with that person not here in the same way. And how do I have that self-confidence with things being so different now? And so I think that's one area where we do see a lot of overlap.
Absolutely. And that's a really great point you mentioned, because that's with all ages as well.
Yes.
And so a lot of times, a parent might say, my child is depressed, when they're seeing that it is the impact of grief maybe on the loss of self, which is coming through the self-esteem. Absolutely.
Well, Angela, you were talking about what intention looks like, and that may include reaching out for support or counseling. And I think that that's another thing that we see as maybe a difference often between grief and maybe clinical depression is seeking out support. A lot of times people who are clinically depressed may isolate. Certainly we see some isolation with grieving people too, and we could talk a lot about that as well. In general, we see with people who are grieving in a healthy way that they readily accept that support, that they reach out to people for support, that they allow people to help them if they have good support systems in place and the ability to receive that support.
We talk so much about support in our podcast and how just critical and important that is. And I think, too, when we're talking about feeling like we've lost, our mind with our grief, or we're talking about depression, knowing how to access support is really important. And so whether that's from a mental health counselor or a grief counselor, there's so many, opportunities through grief groups and online groups and things like that. But I think also we need to remember that there's a hotline for people too through the number of 988, and knowing that you can always find support immediately in those times where you really need to access it right then, and that they're not being shame in that's actually really so brave and self-aware to know I need some support, and I may not know what to do with the support or what to ask of the support, but that first step of seeking the support.
Yes.
Yeah. I like what you said earlier, Lauren, too, about this. If we're thinking about, when people come to us and say, I feel like I've lost my mind. That is such a scary, scary thought. But I think it's so important to remember that grief really does make us slow down. And that a lot of times we fight that. It's just a human reaction that we have because we live in a world of busyness. But with our grief, it really does, our body, our mind really does demand that attention.
Yes.
And a lot of time that is through slowing down. And depressive symptoms, that's what they're for. They're there to help us slow down. So I think it's important, if you're listening to this, that we not view these as negative symptoms. They're actually very helpful. They don't feel the best because they're not what we have learned in our world that are the good feelings, but they're so necessary. And especially in healthy grieving and certainly in healthy mourning, these symptoms that help us do slow down, they allow us to sort of tap into that grief and to do more of that expression. But again, Lauren, what you said, support is critical.
Yeah. It's really about making your grief a priority, recognizing that it's a priority, and that your grief has needs.
Yes. And so just remember, if you're listening to this, there are immediate ways that you can access support, but you can also look into grief counseling, mental health counseling. And I think, too, just listening to this and knowing you haven't lost your mind. You're not crazy.
Right.
You're grieving. And it can be uncomfortable. But grief, we certainly know, is real. That's what we say all the time. It is very big, but it's also better shared.
Yes, absolutely.
Grief does heal. Let me say that again. Grief does heal. But like we've said, grief demands attention and care. It also needs support and patience. Remember that your grief is a reflection of your love. You are not alone. The world is full of many grievers like you. You can learn more about us at www.baptistgriefcenters.org. You can check out our YouTube channel, Baptist Centers for Good Grief. You can check out our podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also, know that you can reach out and let us know if there's a topic that you're interested in learning more about. You're welcome to email me at angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. That's angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. And remember, grief is real, big, better shared. We'll talk soon.